Welcome children. Last class we saw the reign of terror under Robespierre from 1793 to 1794. Robespierre ruled 1 year and finally he was also guillotined in July 1794. After that we can see a directory rules France. The fall of the Jacobin government allowed the wealthier middle classes to seize power. A new constitution was introduced which denied the vote to non-propertied sections of the society. It provided for 2 elected legislative council. These then appointed a directory. What is directory? An executive made up of 5 members. After the failure of Robespierre's rule, then new middle class seized power. They framed a new constitution for France and that denied the voting rights to non-propertied sections of the society. It provided for 2 elected legislative councils. These then appointed a directory. Directory means an executive made up of 5 members. This was meant as a safeguard against the concentration of power in a one-man executive as under Jacobins. The directors often clashed with the legislative council who then sought to dismiss them. So directors rule also over the political instability of the directly paved the way for the rise of a military dictator called Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte is called the child of French Revolution. So after the failure of this directory or the instability of the different government paved the way for the rise of a dictator called Napoleon Bonaparte. Through all these changes in the form of government, the ideals of freedom, equality before the law and of fraternity remained inspiring ideals that motivated political movement in France and the rest of Europe during the following century. Now, let's see the next part. Did women have a revolution? Women actively participated in events that brought important changes in French society. Most women of the Third Estate had to work for a living. They worked as seamstresses, laundresses, sold flowers, fruits and vegetables at the market, etc. Most women did not have access to education or job training. To discuss and voice their interests, they began their political clubs and newspapers. Women formed their own political clubs and newspapers. About 60 women's clubs came up. In that, the Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women was the most famous of them. Their main demand was that women enjoy the same political rights as men. They were disappointed. Women were disappointed that the Constitution of 1791 reduced them to passive citizens. That we saw in last class. Constitution of 1791, there were 2 types of people, active citizen and passive citizen. Women were considered as passive citizens, so they were disappointed. They demanded the right to vote, to be elected to the assembly and to hold political office. Revolutionary governments took some steps in favor of women. It introduced laws to spread education among women and give them job training. Schooling was made compulsory for all girls. Their fathers could no longer force them into marriage against their will. So revolutionary, when women were disappointed, when they were considered as passive citizens, they demanded right to vote. Then later revolutionary governments introduced laws to spread education among women and gave them job training. Schooling was made compulsory for all girls. Their fathers could no longer force them into marriage against their will. Marriage was made into a contract entered into freely and registered under civil laws. Divorce was made legal and could be applied for by both women and men. Women could now train for jobs, could become artists or run small businesses. During the Reign of Terror, the new government issued laws ordering closure of women's clubs and banning their political activities. Many prominent women were arrested and a number of them executed. Women's movement for voting rights continued. The fight for the vote was carried out through an international suffrage movement during the late 19th and early 20th century. It was finally in 1946 that women in France won the right to vote. Next part we can see abolition of slavery. One of the most important revolutionary social reform of the Jacobin regime was the abolition of slavery in French colonies. There was a shortage of labor at the plantation. So Europeans solved this problem by a triangular slave trade between Europe, America and Africa. So there was a shortage of labor at the plantation. Europeans solved this problem by a triangular slave trade between Europe, America and Africa. Slave trade began in the 17th century. So, French merchants sailed to the African coast to buy slaves from their local chieftain. Branded and shackled, the slaves were packed tightly in the ships for a 3-month voyage across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. There they were sold to plantation owners. So port cities like Bordeaux and Nantes become important. They owed their economic prosperity to the flourishing slave trade. Throughout the 18th century, there was a little criticism of slavery in France. The National Assembly held long discussions to provide rights to all the people living in France, but it did not pass any laws. Ultimately, in 1794, Convention passed a law to free all the slaves in the French colonies. This was, however, a short-term measure, as later Napoleon Bonaparte reintroduced slavery. Finally, slavery was abolished in French colonies in 1848. Finally, Convention in 1794, Convention passed a law to free all the slaves in French colonies, but later Napoleon reintroduced slavery. Finally, slavery was abolished in French colonies in 1848. Next part. Let's see the revolution and everyday life. Can politics change the clothes people wear, the language they speak, or the books they read? The years following 1789 in France saw many such changes in the lives of men, women and children. One important law that came into effect soon after the storming of Bastille in the summer of 1789 was the abolition of censorship. What is censorship? In the old regime, all written materials and cultural activities, books, newspapers, plays could be published or performed only after they had been approved by the censors of the king. Now, the Declaration of the Rights of Men and Citizens proclaimed freedom of speech and expression to be a natural right. So, in 1789, after the fall of Bastille, there was one important law brought, that was the abolition of censorship. It changed the lives of common people. Newspapers, pamphlets, books and printed pictures flooded the towns of France from where it reached to the countryside. They all discussed events and changes taking place in France. Freedom of the press also meant that opposing views of events could be expressed. Plays, songs and festive processions attracted common people through which they could identify with ideas such as liberty or justice. Next part, let's see conclusion. We already explained Napoleon Bonaparte came to power as a result of unstable directory that ruled France. So after the end of Directory's rule, Napoleon Bonaparte came to power. In 1804, he crowned himself as the Emperor of France. He set out to conquer the neighboring countries, defeating the dynasties and putting his own relatives of his family. He was seen as a modernizer of Europe. He brought out many laws such as protection of private property and a uniform system of weights and measures provided by the decimal system. He carried out military campaigns and invasions of Russia and Spain. He soon became a threat for the kings in Europe who decided to come together and defeat him. Finally, Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo in 1815. That was the end of Napoleon's rule. The ideas of liberty and democratic rights were the most important legacy of French Revolution. Ideas like liberty, equality, fraternity, etc. given by French Revolution to the world. These spread from France to the rest of Europe during the 19th century. Tipu Sultan and Rajaram Mohan Roy was two examples of individuals who responded to the ideas coming from revolutionary France. Tipu Sultan planted a tree of liberty at Srirangapatnam, his capital, and declared himself as Citizen Tipu.